Good evening, everyone. My name is Ara Fellows, and I'm a senior associate here at Vinson & Elkins. I'm pleased to welcome you to V&E this evening for our program, Civil Rights and Racial Healing, Examining the History and Future of Reparations in America. We think this is going to be an exciting program that will prompt us to reflect on the significant role we have as lawyers in furthering societal justice. Dr. King famously said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think people a lot of times take a deterministic view of this and think, oh, well, society will just keep getting more fair and more just and more equitable because that's what history has always been, right? Just a long march towards progress. But programs like this remind us that the moral arc of the universe is not fated towards justice. Progress is won when people roll up their sleeves, get their hands on that arc, and tug. And so our work tonight and moving forward is to continue this dialogue, educate ourselves, and to commit to collective action, because that's where our power lies. That moral arc bends towards justice a lot quicker when we work together. And you and me, my friends, we're the benders. So thank you all for attending tonight's program. And with that, enjoy the film.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending both online and in person. My name is Peggy Lee. I'm the Director of Chapters at the American Constitution Society. I also serve on the D&I Committee for the AABA of Houston. I am so honored to welcome Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter to this program. Some of y'all know I had the honor of recording a podcast with him last month, which was released on February 1st. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Broken Law. So Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter is the Scott Wall Endowed Chair in the Division of the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at UCLA. He is the coiner of hashtag Black Lives Matter and the author of 4 books, including his forthcoming book, Radical Reparations. His research, activism, and commentary have been featured in several journals and news outlets. So thank you, Dr. Hunter, for joining us virtually from Los Angeles.
Peace, everybody. Hey, Peggy, good to see you again. I just want to thank you all for doing this event and also just shining the light on these important issues. Ahead of my time with you all, which I know is very brief, I wanted to share some remarks that are, as they say, hot off the presses from my book, Radical Reparations, which I think crystallizes a lot of the ideas, a lot of the content, and a lot of the issues that are ahead of us with some insight. If anything about slavery is true, then anything is possible. All we genuinely live are stories, the one we create, the ones created for us, and the ones kept secret. America is not just a set of states, cities, territories, laws, cultures, and customs. America is first and foremost a story, a collection of ideas and imagination. When and where you enter the American story does not preclude the narrative that has already taken shape. All points of entry are built atop the existing premise of America, enslavement and land dispossession. America is a beautiful mansion with many rooms on a beautiful block. Gleaming beauty from the outside, America on the inside reveals a different story. So thoroughly impressed with America's exterior, those who enter inside are often aghast. Across as many rooms are piles of wall-to-wall, dirty, filthy laundry. Piles on piles, flies swirl above and below the piles. The stench and filth surrounds you until you no longer notice it. And though there seems to be no room, more piles emerge as you find your spot inside. Piles everywhere. 1, political reparations, restorative and reparative, historically informed advocacy, transforming government and political representation and participation. 2, intellectual reparations, the purposeful and public recognition and acknowledgement of the creations, inventions, and ideas of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. 3, legal reparations, restorative justice and racial equity established and authorized in laws and policies. 4, economic reparations, pecuniary and/or monetary assistance, subsidy, restitution, and debt relief. 5, social reparations, restoration and repair of the social contract to end racism and mindsets premised on racial and ethnic hierarchy, thus affirming the dignity of human beings. 6, spatial reparations, a restorative and reparative geography of socioeconomic and political opportunity, particularly for those displaced and dispossessed by American slavery and their descendants. And 7, spiritual reparations, the purposeful and intentional recognition, representation, and recovery of the religious and spiritual cosmologies, practices, and beliefs harmed and lost in the triangle slave trade and American slavery. Within these 7 forms of reparations or piles, we can unlock a new foundation and new pathway to truth, love, justice, and freedom in America and everywhere Black people are heretofore, also known as what I call radical reparations. Our divinely manifested and shared humanity has been the original promise and bond that enslavement and land dispossession disfigured. We can and must heed the domestic and global calls for comprehensive repair, racial healing, equity, and truth. As challenging as the work ahead may appear, it is nowhere near what our ancestors endured. If we can begin to acknowledge and unlearn the false premise that diminishes reparations simply as a racial problem, then we achieve the new untapped radical awareness of it instead as what it truly is, a fundamental, urgent human crisis in need of redress. When Black people were chained, held captive, tortured, kidnapped, raped, bought, and sold, our collective humanity was too. Slavery is not just an aspect of American and global history. It is a founding premise of the current human condition. Therefore, a radical reparative justice frame is always already based on rescuing and restoring the soul of humanity. For the human race is the only true race that exists. Europeans imported and exported a global distortion of the ancient system of primary colors to subjugate Black people. Black as a color was perverted into something other than the powerful foundational hue that manages to absorb all other colors while maintaining its integrity. White juxtaposed Black, the color white then elevated at the expense of red, yellow, and blue and their purple, green, and orange children. Once upon a time, not long ago, there was no such thing as white people. Domination over humans, nations, and continents is why systemic racism exists. And while the distorted color system has organized our ideas of race, value, and a hierarchy of humanity, we can opt into something healthier, something more authentic. We can return the system into balance. What is distorted can always be healed, for it is an underlying pain that hides and controls our sense of the future, revealing only unverified and useless fears of one another. May the truth and what is possible serve as a new lighthouse to guide us into the purposeful and collective work needed to build the world we know is possible. A world where we embrace and accept the harms of the past, leaning into it not to blame or shame, rather to build and construct a new infrastructure of love and freedom that balances and replaces the old and existing systems of racism and human hierarchy with systemic equity and systemic humanity, continuously working to repair and reconcile the sins of a system, country, and people while long gone are still with us. I think here we can begin. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm so glad and blessed to be before you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, for taking the time to join us virtually and for helping us understand how the movement for reparations fits within this larger movement for truth, racial healing, and transformation. And I want to thank you to all of our attendees. I don't know if the folks on Zoom can see, but this is a pretty full room. It's really good to see the top half of your faces. I think I know who most of you are. But thank you. First we want to thank the Asian American Bar Association of Houston, the American Constitution Society Houston Lawyer Chapter, the Houston Lawyers Association for collaborating to host this event. I also want to thank our sponsors, Vincent and Elkins LLP, AZA Law, Mayor Brown, Smizer Kaplan and Valeska LLP for supporting this program. We wouldn't be able to put it together without all of y'all, so thank you so much. So before we start, I do want to make a quick disclaimer. ACS is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. The hosting organizations don't endorse any candidates or political parties. Views expressed by the speakers reflect their individual opinions and should not be attributed to ACS, ABA of Houston, HLA, or the sponsors. All right, so today we have the unique privilege to hear from community organizers, faith-based leaders, lawyers, elected officials, academics, and a filmmaker, all working towards building systemic equity. This is especially important as we mark Black History Month, the Day of Remembrance of Executive Order 9066, and a Day of Remembrance of the Sugarland 95. It's all in the last like 7 days and months. So perfect timing. I will give a very, very quick intro to our speakers, but I do encourage you all to Google them and learn more about them. So John Asagaki is on my right. He's an award-winning filmmaker who has directed and produced promotional, educational, narrative, and documentary films, including the documentary you just watched. Professor Lori Benai is the director of the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at the Seattle University School of Law and served on the Korematsu Quorum Nobis team that overturned Fred Korematsu's 40-year conviction. Reverend David Sincere Jr. is the pastor at the Fort Bend Transformation Church. He also started the Advocacy Now Institute in 2017 to address the systemic issues that negatively impact economically disadvantaged communities. And the furthest from me is Ms. Robin Cole. She's the president of the Society of Justice and Equality of the People of Sugarland. They are working to confront our history of racial injustice and to seek justice for the Sugarland 95. And we'll hear more about that later today. But I am going to start with John. That was a really incredibly powerful film with the perspective that I know that I did not learn growing up, and I think most of us did not learn. So I'd love to hear about what made you make this film, what it means to you. I learned a little bit about your family's history related to the commissions and reparations, so would love for you to share that today.
Press this. Just turn it on.
Oh, here you go. Take mine.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I just want to thank you all for coming out here today and for giving me the opportunity to share this film and to have this discussion. So Lori and I are part of a group called Stop Repeating History. And so we have been for the last several years having events just like this to talk about the ways that racist patterns in this country repeat themselves, whether it is the incarceration of Lori and myself's family during World War II, as well as issues that have affected all communities of color in this country. And so after the murder of George Floyd, I think our group really kind of regrouped and thought about how can we have an impact? Because we had spent a lot of time talking about the Japanese American Incarceration story and how those lessons are still so prevalent and so relevant today. But we started to think about how can we have a larger conversation about issues affecting other communities, and in particular, because of what just happened, the Black community. And so I was asked to work on this film, and it seemed a natural topic for us to take up because many of us are Japanese Americans. Our families did receive reparations. And I think for a lot of us, we feel like there's a certain level of responsibility that we have to address the harm that has taken place in this country that is still yet to be atoned for. So obviously, when I undertook this film, it was a tremendous amount of humility. And I'm very fortunate that I'm back in San Francisco, where I run a nonprofit. I have longstanding relationships and have worked in partnerships with the Black community for a long, long time. So I was able to call upon leaders from the area that I'm from who are just incredibly generous in sharing their knowledge, sharing their insights, and to make this film possible. And it was really a way, what we hoped it could be is a way to really inform other communities, right? To really share with them what this is really about. Because going into this project, I knew a little bit about the Black reparations movement, but the individuals that I had the privilege to interview for this just taught me so much. And I think our hope was to really share that with as many folks, as many communities as possible. And it's very personal for me because, my father and mother were both incarcerated during World War II. And in 1981, this United States government, through the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, held public hearings, right? And that was the first opportunity for former incarcerees to share their story. And it was incredibly emotional. And so for my father, he initially was not sure he wanted to attend. He was a little ambivalent about it, but eventually he made his way to one of those hearings. And he shared with me and my family a couple times that he spent almost the entire time listening during that hearing with tears streaming down his face. And that it was incredibly healing for him to hear the stories of our community and what they went through, to go through the process of there being acknowledgement by this government, and through redress and eventual reparations. And as I was working on this film, what I couldn't help but think is, that reparations is so much about healing, and why wouldn't we want to heal this country?
Thank you so much, John. I'll come back to you later in this panel. So Lori, I am going to ask you to tell us more about Japanese incarceration, but I do want to hear if you had any reflections on John's film or what he just said.
I really, really appreciate John's ability to teach us, what I learned about the legacy of slavery, how it's been passed on and generations later, about how this country still has benefited from all of that, that the labor of enslaved peoples, all of that. And in addition, particularly for me, I'll just echo what John says about being Japanese American. Of course, slavery and the legacy of slavery is entirely different in kind and in scope from the incarceration of Japanese Americans. But I will say that one of the things that I really appreciated out of John's film was a message about how we're all in this together. The same systems that have served to dehumanize Blacks ever since slavery have been used to dehumanize other people of color, Asian Americans and other people of color in this country. And if you look at some of the original cases, the Chinese American immigration cases, it talks about Chinese being these vast hordes of kind of yellow peril coming to infect the country. You see the laws, anti-miscegenation laws, preventing Blacks and Asians from intermarrying with whites. You see segregated schools for Japanese children. Again, the idea of impurity, the idea of less than human and not being able to mix. Ta-Nehisi Coates called the issue of reparations about citizenship, and that really struck me because I think our history as Asian Americans has also been about non-citizenship and being excluded from the incidence of citizenship and full participation in this country. And so I often think about the Japanese American incarceration as the ultimate exclusion after a history of exclusion. When my parents, John's parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, my mother was a 16-year-old high school student, and my father was a 22-year-old just starting out in his career at the time. Their families were taken away. And so I truly appreciate, I totally agree with John that I think Japanese Americans having gone through the experience of racism in this country, the same system that has operated against people of color and immigrant people, we have a particular responsibility for standing up and speaking up. Almost nobody stood up and spoke up when Japanese Americans were sent to camp, and we all have that responsibility. And a really important thing is that Asian Americans cannot be used or continue to be used as a wedge to separate out, good people of color and bad people of color or anything. Asian Americans need to stand up and say, no matter what, we're forever foreign. People can say all kinds of things they want about us, but they're still attacking us on the streets because we're forever foreign, and we need to stand together. So thank you, John. Thank you, all of you.
There you go. Thank you for that, Lori. And I think I told some of the panelists, but not all the panelists, but anytime y'all want to speak, just jump right in. I like it when the conversation moves around, so interrupt me. So Lori, going back to you, I'll let you sip some water. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave surviving incarcerated Japanese Americans $20,000 in reparations and a formal apology for incarceration in internment camps during World War II. Okay, this is a really big task, but can you just briefly kind of go through some background on Japanese incarceration, the commission that John and you just mentioned, and the resulting reparations? I didn't learn this growing up, so I don't know how many of y'all did.
So there was in 1948, 6 years after, or 3 years after the camps began to close, there was an initial effort at some form of reparation, which was actually totally inadequate and totally ridiculous because it required receipts, like how many people took their receipts with them when they were sent to camp. So it required documentation, very little return on that. So afterwards, people got on with their lives. I mean, so many Japanese Americans, it was really just a matter of trying to rebuild their lost lives, their lost communities, their businesses and everything. Then in the late 1960s, early 1970s, again, as a result of result of activism of the Black community, the civil rights movement, the movement for ethnic studies, Asian Americans were able to find their voices as well through saying, look at how the Black community is speaking, how they're speaking up for their rights. And Asian Americans started to say, we need to learn our histories. And I'll preface this by saying our parents didn't talk about it, right? Our parents did not talk about the Japanese American incarceration. We didn't know that they had been incarcerated. They didn't talk about it. And so actually, I learned a lot of my history from ethnic studies in college. This is what happened and other people who wrote about it. So as a result of the civil rights movement, people started to learn the history and people started to talk about redress and about whether there was a way to address the wrong that had committed against the community. And I will say and emphasize it was extremely controversial. There were people within the community who said nothing is acceptable other than direct monetary payments. We want checks issued from the government and we want it now. That's the way our society deals with wrongs, our checks. Some people didn't want to discuss it at all. Again, this notion that, people didn't want to talk about it. There's something in Japanese called shikatakanai, which is it's already happened. What will be, leave well enough alone. Let's not talk about it. So painful to return to that period of time. There were people who were angry, so angry that no amount of money, you cannot reduce what happened to them into a check. And some people wanted a commission to study that was basically no one's going to be able to understand the losses that happened unless you have a commission that does research, that talks to experts and puts together a study. We needed that history. We needed to know what caused the incarceration. We needed to know what the losses were. Again, deeply divisive within the community. But what was more important than anything else and is important today is the need to talk, even if you disagree, is the need to bring it all out in the open and have a national conversation about the wrong that occurred. Congress ultimately appointed a commission, as John said, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, really long names these commissions have, that did exhaustive research, hundreds of thousands of government documents, legislative, executive, military, testimony taken at hearings all over the country from experts, from government officials, from lawyers, from psychologists, and testimony, the most moving testimony from those who had been incarcerated, talking about how they were taken from their homes, talking about the loss of their communities, the loss of their freedom, the loss of their dignity, the loss of family structures, the loss of opportunity, and all of that, and their children, talking about intergenerational trauma. That was hugely impactful, as John said, for our community, mainly also because our parents never talked about it. So initially, a few people came forward to speak at these hearings, but once our parents saw other people speak, then they wanted to speak too. And it became a real cleansing moment for people to be able to tell their stories and to feel like they were being heard. There's a commission report called Personal Justice Denied. It's a fat report. It will be minuscule compared to the report that comes out on Black reparations. But that report the commission concluded that the incarceration was the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. and recommended a national apology and $20,000 per surviving person who was incarcerated. But by that time, of course, many had passed away. There was extensive lobbying afterwards for appropriations because you get the law passed, but then you've got to get appropriations. The first redress checks were issued in October 1990. But one thing I really want to emphasize that I think was very critical was an education fund that was created by Congress. So that has created pieces of art, films, plays, books, memorials. It's funded restoration of some of the camps that are out there that people can visit. It's funded curriculum projects that can be used in schools, and those have been incredibly important. In addition, on the state and local level, Washington and California have had their own education funds that are still in existence, and people can still apply for them. And at the even more local level, universities have granted honorary degrees to Japanese Americans who were forced to leave their educations. Cities and counties have had days of remembrance. So the effort still continues here. Local bar associations sponsor Day of Remembrance. Law firms participate in that. Every year, February 19th is a day when we all come together. So education has been a huge, huge thing. Deeply concerned about attacks on ethnic studies today, but that in hopefully sufficiently short time is the history of redress.
You should do those 5-minute videos that explain everything. But thank you for providing that background. I did not know a lot of that, and I'm from California. But we're not going to shift the conversation to the movement for reparations today. So I think most of y'all know, and it was addressed in the film, there are bills there are 2 bills actually going through Congress right now on the movement for reparations and the movement for truth, racial healing, and transformation. I'll just give a quick overview on both of those. So HR 40 would establish a 15-member commission to study the effects of slavery and discriminatory policies on African Americans and recommended appropriate remedies, including reparations. And that commission would report its findings and recommendations to Congress 18 months after its first meeting, and then it would terminate 90 days after the report is submitted. So as the film noted, the late Congressman John Conyers first introduced HR 40 more than 30 years ago on the heels of the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which Lori just discussed. So HR 40 didn't really gain a lot of momentum until 2019 when the House held its second congressional hearing on the bill. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who we will hear from later today in person, took over as the bill's lead sponsor after Conyers' death in 2019. It advanced out of committee last April. It has not been taken up for consideration by the full House of Representatives. Last February, so the second bill, last February, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Senator Cory Booker introduced legislation to the House and Senate calling for an establishment of the U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. That's H-Con Res 19 and S-Con Res 6. That commission would properly acknowledge, memorialize, and be a catalyst for progress toward jettisoning the belief in a hierarchy of human value, embracing our common humanity, and permanently eliminating persistent racial inequities. So to segue into our conversation on reparations for Black Americans, I do also want to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates. So this is from the Case for Reparations. So in it, he opens with 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. And so, Reverend Sincere, this next question is to you. In reflecting on the documentary and the quote, can you talk a bit about reparations and the need to have open and honest discussions about our nation's racist history?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share on this very important topic. I think the film was very well done. It shows how individuals of color, people of color in this country, no matter what that color is, have been discriminated against. And that it has had a psychological, emotional, and financial economic impact on those individuals. It's what creates others, right? And as long as we continue to create others in terms of the discrimination that has been perpetuated against us, really going back in terms of slavery and what happened to our brothers and sisters, Japanese brothers and sisters, it will continue to be a cancer in this country. And so leading into that and talking about the history of what has been perpetuated against African Americans in this country, I wanted to start off by telling my story for a few minutes. And when I was a young man, when I was younger, right, I had my first job, and my boss asked me to come to the office. And when he asked me to come to the office, he said, "Well, David, I'm going to have to move you." And I said, "Why?" I said, "I think I'm doing a good job." And he framed his comments like this. He said, "Well, some bosses, some owners, they have the opportunity or the choice to choose." He said that this particular boss, he doesn't want black paint on the wall. He wants white paint on the wall. And so what he was in translation telling me is that that particular owner did not want African Americans working in that particular position at that particular location. So I'm going to move you somewhere else. And so we really have to ask ourselves the question of, how did we even get this concept of black and white? Where did it come from? Why did we start to categorize ourselves and put ourselves into groups in America? Where did the white concept or black concept come from in America? Well, I'm so glad you asked. When we look at what happened in 1676 at Bacon's Rebellion, we know that we had, in 1611, we know that we had indentured servants come here, white indentured servants come here. We know that we had slaves arrived here in Jamestown, and we know that we had the elite, right? And so Bacon and those poor indentured servants, as well as the slaves, they rebelled, right? Bacon's Rebellion. And in that rebellion, they basically took over the town. And so they sent over 1,000 soldiers there. The British sent over 1,000 soldiers there to crush the rebellion. Well, what happened out of that, Virginia and the people were so devastated and terrified based on a rebellion that they basically started slavery in terms of making that the predominant way of getting free labor in the country. And over time, what happened is you had the whole system of indentured servants go away, and then you had slavery take over. And what the white poor people were told was that you will always be over the black slaves. Right. And so over about 120 years, you started creating this class. You started creating this whole idea of blackness in America and what that represents and what whiteness represents, that even the poor white people would be over the slaves and that the elite would be over everyone. And so that is what produced in this country slavery, convict leasing, the black codes, Jim Crow, separate but never equal, housing insecurity, residential segregation, sundown towns, job insecurity, the prison industrial complex, the achievement gap, the opportunity gap, the income gap, the equity gap, and the wealth gap. It's how we have learned to identify each other and put those individuals in categories and create others, right? Create others so that a small group could exploit another group for their benefit. And that's what we've been facing in this country. And so when we talk about the social construct and the exploitation of Black people in this country, we know that African-American Black people in this country slaved and they built this country, but we have not really gotten credit for that. Right? Y'all, everybody agree? Mm-hmm. Okay, and so it's benefited that upper class white folk. Now, would I consider this as being a moral issue? As a man of faith, as a pastor, this is a moral issue. And so if we talked about reparations in terms of the term that we use today in a theological or biblical term, in an exegetical standpoint, we would say restitution. Right? Restitution is a moral concept that comes from the Bible. And restitution basically means that if you have stolen, if you have disgraced, if you have taken things from someone else, the whole idea of restitution is to restore it back plus 20%. That's a biblical concept. So this is an issue that ultimately deals with the moral integrity of this country, right? We should have a moral imperative to know that this is a justice issue. It's the right thing to do. And if we don't do it as a nation, if we don't actualize and be mindful and admit the stories of what has been perpetuated, if we don't realize that Black history, Japanese history, Latino history, it's all American history, then ultimately we will lose ourselves, continue to lose ourselves, and be morally impotent. And I think that is the thing that is the most important thing in this country, that in order for us to be the best America that we can be, in order for us to live up to the values that we proclaim to the entire world, we talk about slavery and all the things that I listed, we need to acknowledge it. And we need to deal with it so that we can heal. There's a scripture, and I'm not going to preach, but there's a scripture that really, from at least the Christian church, gives us a mandate. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, it says, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow." I think that if we can all learn to love each other and to heal and to take up that cause and that mandate, then we can live up to the values that this country has proclaimed for many years. Thank you.
I think that is so Lori, the next question is to you. So one of the goals of this conversation is to provide our attendees just with the tools to be able to have these discussions. Like, they won't be at an hour and a half, program to be able to get all of this. So how do we, in our everyday communications with family, friends, community members, how do we talk to them about reparations and truth and racial healings? How do you define these terms when you talk to others? Like, how do you do it to a neighbor?
I love the way that this discussion is being framed. I love the way this discussion is being framed, not only about repair and atonement for the wrong that's been committed against the Black community and that endures today, but also about healing our country and about this healing being important for our entire country. We're out there, we talk about, we complain about civil rights violations in China and everything. And people are shocked, of course, to hear about slavery and about the Japanese American incarceration. We need to be honest, and we need to have these conversations. We need to talk to our kids about how this is our country, and we're a big country, and we're a great country. We can recognize the wrongs that occurred, right? And that's a big country. We need to be able to do that. We can't hide it. So I think that that's an important thing to do, is that this isn't about the past. It's about the present and doing the right thing. The other thing is that reparations is not and cannot be truly repair. We can't really truly repair, but we can do what we can to recognize, to tell the stories, to make sure that our history is an inclusive one, that people aren't left out. So, I mean, if anyone comes up and says, well, how are you going to pay for it? It'll cost millions of dollars. Like, well, yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's not even about like total repair, but at least it's trying. One thing that I think is really important is that I tell people is that it's what will repair is up to the community that's been wronged. And it's not for anybody else to be able to say, well, what they should get is this, or what they don't get is that. That's not, it was up to the Japanese American community what would work, right? Or what would at least attempt to address. And so what's really important is, I think what happened with the Japanese American community is to hear the voices, hear the stories from the Black community, hear about the wrongs that have been passed down, the injuries that have endured, and let the country hear that. And that's what's really, really important. And that when it comes time for figuring out remedy, don't start arguing about remedy right now. Don't say we can't have the conversation because it's going to cost too much. It's like, have the conversation, talk about the wrong, hear the stories, and then think about remedy. And so I think what I would tell people is let the conversation be had. You know, let people bring this to the forefront. We have a terrible race problem in this country. Everybody will agree with that. We're not going to address it by not talking about it. I think what's really, I'll say a couple things, it's not really about money. I would really make that point to people. It will never be enough. $20,000 was not enough to compensate for the losses to the Japanese American community, but it's a very meaningful symbol. And of course, some people could really use it. An apology is not enough, but it's essential. I mean, I think some people talked about how the apology was, Satsuka Ina, talks about how her mother had the apology framed in the check, kind of like sitting on the table, but the apology meant a lot. So I think that has to be recognized. But I think, again, going back to the notion of citizenship, I think a full-throated embrace of a community that's been so terribly wronged is essential, and full-throated embrace, again, legally, legally, emotionally, psychologically, in all of those different ways, I think is really what reparations is about.
So, John, the next question is for you. As reflected in the film, it was really, you don't see this as often as you should. So thank you so much for representing this in the film, but seeing Japanese American activists mobilizing to support the push for Black Americans and the push for reparations. I want to talk a little bit and hear from you a little more about the critical role that solidarity plays between communities in acknowledging and addressing systemic racism in America.
Sure. So before the program started here today, I was sharing with Reverend Sincere that I run a child and youth development nonprofit in San Francisco. And we were started almost 52 years ago by students who were part of the Third World strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. And what was so significant about that moment in history was that it was Black Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, Native Americans coming together to demand acknowledgement for their individual histories, right? And they're acknowledging how our experiences have been so unique in this country. And that spirit of working together led to ethnic studies happening throughout this country. And it really changed the trajectory of America in so many ways. It empowered communities in so many different ways. And so I think that as the Stop Repeating History team were recalibrating, thinking about what was happening around us, it became crystal clear that, we are only going to make significant progress in addressing systemic racism by working together, right? And part of the way that systemic racism works is those who promote it want us only in our communities, listening to each other and speaking on behalf of ourselves, right? They don't want us working together. They don't want us lifting each other up, speaking on behalf of each other and the issues that each of our communities care about, because they realize, and I point to this example all the time because it's come up over and over again in my research, is that I always make the point that so that when my organization was created from the student strikes, the governor of California at that time was Ronald Reagan. And why I think it's so significant is, first of all, the strikes enraged him. But I think he learned an important lesson during that time in that he saw the power of communities working together and what it could lead to. And he was very intentional when he became president about dividing our communities, right? And I think that that's a playbook that has been executed over and over again, is to find ways, because those who embrace systemic racism in this country, right, do not want our communities to collectively build power together. But I'm convinced that that is the way that we are going to make progress in addressing issues affecting the Black community, issues affecting the Asian American community. And that is why I think opportunities like this, conversations like this are so important, and we need to be doing more of this throughout this country.
So I'm going to, Reverend is here, go first.
Sorry, but turn on the mic. I think one of the ways to address what you articulated in your question is, first of all, I think that we as individuals, whether we're Black, white, Hispanic, no matter what color we are, we need to look at ourselves. What do we believe? How do we treat people? I think that if each individual look within themselves in the most inner part of their consciousness and say, how am I helping to perpetuate a system in personal individual racism, and what can I do to change that? I think we can have a better America. It starts with us in our hearts. And so that's what I try to do. When I look at an individual through the lens of my eye, how do I view that individual? How do I perceive that individual? Is it right or is it wrong? I think that Dr. King talked and told us that love is the most powerful force in the universe, and that hate cannot extinguish hate. Only love can do that. But in order to activate that power, it starts with me. And so that's what my call to action or my recommendation would be for each and every one of us to make a better America. I need to first start off with myself to make a better me.
And I really love that you kept using the term othering earlier in your remarks, because I'm always thinking that, yes, we other people. And so the question is, how do we build and bring people into that circle of human concern? And that does start with each one of us. And hopefully then it, becomes communities, nationwide. But actually now I want to switch over to talk to local movements, and I'll get Robin in here as well. So there has been a lot going on locally, and I don't know how much folks have been paying attention. I'll do a real quick overview. So in March of last year, Evanston, Illinois became the first U.S. city to issue reparations for slavery. Did folks know that? Okay. So rather than they, instead of giving direct payments of reparations, they gave residents funds for home repairs and property costs. The housing program directly acknowledges and addresses the historical harm done to Evanston residents through discriminatory housing policies and practices and inaction by the city. In California, Assembly Bill 3121 was enacted in the fall of 2020, and that established a 9-member task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. So the purpose of that task force is 1, to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans, 2, to recommend appropriate ways to educate the California public of the task force's findings, and 3, to recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the task force finding. So the task force is going to issue 2 reports. The first one will be out this June. It will be a through line from 400 years of oppression to current day consequences. It'll be of hundreds of pages. It'll have 12 different parts. I'm not going to name them all, but do look out for that report. I think that's going to be it'll be breathtaking, and it'll be, I think I remember reading that John was saying that it'll be like the Kerner Commission, but for today's day and age. If you don't know what the Kerner Commission is, please go Google that as well. Part 2 of the report will be released in June of 2023, and that will discuss the definition of reparations and examples of reparations, responsibility for paying reparations, forms of reparations, and so on. But like Lori said, we need to start by doing the research and learning about the history and having that conversation. There are several other local movements that are happening. So the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is a Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity program. I think this one made the news. The movement at Georgetown University, which has also taken steps toward reparative justice, thanks to the work of student leaders there. There's also a movement for reparations for Indigenous peoples for the occupation of Native American land. And there are more. I don't want to give you more little lists, but Princeton's Bridging Divides initiatives has a great map that maps out support for truth, racial healing, and transformation. So if you Google Princeton Bridging Divides, truth, racial healing, transformation, you can check out that interactive map to see what's going on all across the country. But now we'll switch over to Robin. So to continue this conversation on looking local, I'd really like to pass the mic to Robin Cole, the president of the Society of Justice and Equality for the People of Sugarland. Robin, can you tell our audience about the work that you do at SOJAS, the Sugarland 95, and the goals of SOJAS? And cue to our tech people, this is where we need the PowerPoint slides. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here this evening. And it is my pleasure to be able to bring to the surface what has been going on in Sugarland, Texas. Many people see Sugarland as an upscale community. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I was relocated here about 26 years ago, and I currently live in New Territory. Right off of Highway 90 is a prison. Up a ways is the Imperial Sugar Mill that has been closed. I went past that mill many times, and at Christmas time, they got the sign of the cross, and I just always saw Sugarland as a fantasy place, like, oh, sweet sugar, Sugarland, just happy, happy, happy. 4 years ago, 2018, Fort Bend ISD was in the process of constructing a school, a career and technical school. There was a man by the name of Daniel Diaz. He was a backhoe operator. And as he's digging the soil, he saw something that looked like a bone. So they stopped. They said, we need to get this analyzed. They analyzed it at a lab. I'm not going to say what that lab is, but it came back 99% not human. There was another man, Oscar Perez, who works for Fort Bend ISD. I'm sending it to another lab. It came back 100% human. The city of Sugarland, and you wonder why the mall is called First Colony? It's because in 1821, when Moses Austin came to San Antonio because he wanted to colonize that area of Mexico, on his way back to Missouri, he got sick talked to his son, Stephen F. Austin, who was in New Orleans, to say, I have this grant and they're giving me permission to bring 300 families from different parts of the United States to this area. Stephen F. Austin said, in order to do that, I have to give an incentive. He gave 50 acres for every African American that they brought with them. 50 acres for free. They didn't have to pay for that. If you read the history books in Texas, it says nothing about African Americans at all. I had to read about 10 books to get the information I'm giving you. In 1860, which was 3 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, there were 90% Black people in Fort Bend County, 90%. Where I live in New Territory used to be cotton plantation and then eventually a sugar cane field. The African Americans worked for 2 men under this 5-year lease, Edward Cunningham and Littlebury Ellis. 5 years. From 1879 to 1884, they had every single convict in Texas. They had over 2,300. They built their sugar mill. They built the railroad. They had a sulfuric acid plant. They had another paper mill. They built every single thing in Sugarland. You hear nothing or see nothing about that. The reason why the Society of Justice and Equality for the People of Sugarland was formed is because I live 5 minutes around the corner from the 95 souls who was buried in an unmarked grave. 2 years ago, when I went over there, that grass was 18 inches high. And they knew that there was 94 men and 1 woman in there. They took DNA samples. They claim they don't have money to finish the analysis. That's unacceptable. To me, I have an obligation to do what I have to do. I have 3 children. We formed a 501c3. And like I said to my daughter, if I had to sell my house to get a loan to build a monument, find their families, because they were somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's brother. They were Americans. Our history books call them convicts or prisoners or slaves. Oh, no. They were African-American people who were part of an unjust system known as convict leasing. Convict leasing was worse than slavery. The Constitution was passed in 1787, which was 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution was amended 27 times. The 13th Amendment, that was what, 1865, because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves like they thought. Contrary to popular belief, when Lincoln signed that, it only freed the slaves in certain states. 2 years later, during the Civil War, that 13th Amendment, the way it was written, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, listen to this, except as a punishment for a crime whereby the person is duly convicted shall exist in the United States of America. That was the start of mass incarceration. In 1871, there was a meeting right here in Fort Bend County, and they're like, you know what? Our revenue's drying up. People were set free, the farms, everything is going down. They gave a lease to these 2 men in Galveston for them to lease African-American men. They leased them because they could not find people who's going to work in a sugarcane plantation. That is the worst than cotton, tobacco, corn combined. These people, if you read books like One Guy Gets Another, the Sugarland 95, the youngest one was 14 years old. Except as a punishment for a crime, the crime was if you were an orphan, if you were homeless, if you was on the wrong side of the street, If you stole something for $1, your punishment was 4 to 6 years hard labor. They weren't all from Texas. They were from Georgia, Tennessee, New York. They lasted from 2 weeks to maybe like 10 months. They never had a chance to go back home to their families. That's why we formed our organization. We are going to raise funds. We have faith the size of a mustard seed. And we're going to just have people who want to help us. And it's not just money. If you're a grant writer, if you're someone who doesn't mind, social media is all about truth telling. The truth needs to be told in order for us to heal as a community and heal as a nation. And that's why we are here. David was one of our board members. David has brought us to the next level with the interfaith community. We have 6 other volunteers. We're somebody's mother, father, grandmother. We're not getting paid for this, but we're working with Commissioner Rodney Ellis and Commissioner Kendra Merchant, Fort Bend ISD Superintendent Christy Whitbeck, because we know we have to do this together. It has to be the community, state, federal. We have to do this together because those 95 people have a right to be reunited with their families. Thank you.
And Robin, I know there's an event tomorrow, so I didn't know if you wanted to plug that.
I do, and it's free. It's free. And we are going to have Dr. Whitbeck there. Our speaker is Dr. Matthew Mancini. I actually put together like a welcome little basket for him. He flew down from St. Louis, Missouri. He's staying in Sugarland at the Hilton Garden Inn, and I call myself going over to leave him a welcome to Sugarland basket. And who do I run into but Dr. Mancini? I was so happy to see him. I said, I'm so honored you're here. And he said, no, I'm honored to be here. So please, if you have 2 hours in your time tomorrow, please come out. Right now we're at 250 people, and we do have snacks. It's being sponsored by ATB. And it's going to be eye-opening because I don't want to give too much away, but I have 4 Their Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. My son and 3 of his fraternity members, they're going to bring 4 of the Sugarland 95 to life. So you're going to hear about 4 of the other men tomorrow because there's a 520-page report that Fort Bend ISD has out there. And they found 78 of the 95, but they don't know which grave belongs to them because it's like unknown. If you go over to Sugarland, in the cemetery, it's unknown. They have markers now. But we want to make sure that we understand who belongs in which grave so that when their families are reunited with them, they can go to that location to pay respect to their families.
Thank you so much, Robin. And you can go to the SOJES website for folks who are online and can't physically attend. It's sojes.org.
Yes.
Okay. So Reverend Sincere, I'm sorry to go to you after that, but I know we were preparing for this program and you talked a little bit about convict leasing in the Houston area too. So I want to know if you had any reflections on what Robin said or anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, the convict leasing system was a Texas convict leasing system. And so in the neighborhood that I live in, I went back and I started studying the history of Siena, formerly known as Siena Plantation. And there were 500 slaves that worked that land. And then after slavery was abolished, there was 150 convict leases that worked that land. This was a part of the economic system that fueled the economy. And so, many places have grave sites that's been covered by subdivisions, golf courses, stores, and all of that. And so, even in my neighborhood, and we probably live about 25 minutes from each other, Convict Leasing was a big part of what made Houston wealthy. Two of the former mayors of Houston own the land that I currently live on. They own that land. And Mr. Waters, on that land, one of the former mayors of Houston is the one that had the 150 convict leases on that land. And it helped to build wealth for the Houston and surrounding area.
Thank you so much. And I see that our wonderful closing speaker is here. I know all of our speakers have advice and would love for y'all to take away some next steps. There seems to be a lot of opportunity for positive change right now. And so to help our attendees take advantage of this movement, can y'all give like really quick next steps for folks before I introduce Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee? Any order, Robin? Yes.
So the loophole that I recited that's in the 13th Amendment is still in there. So next steps can be to write to your congressman or woman to say, because that loophole continues to enslave our people today, 2022. They continue to work for free in the prison system.
One of the things that you can do is just get involved in some area. There's a lot of different areas that you can get involved in. One of the things that Advocacy Now do is we mentor 130 kids in a 94% economically disadvantaged area. We're dealing with housing insecurity issues, job insecurity issues, and we're leading the charge concerning juvenile justice reform in Fort Bend County. And so there's a plethora of different things you can do. You can write letters, you can get involved, you can mentor kids, you can help sit in courts like we've done and advocate for parents that have been exploited concerning housing and evictions and all that kind of stuff. And so just let your mind and your imagination run wild and just get involved.
Just like this program we have here, educate yourself about the movement for Black reparations, educate others, ensure that our children and our college students are educated, act locally to ensure that we teach an inclusive history of this country, and resist efforts to clean classrooms of the diversity of our rich history and to deny the wrongs that have been committed in our society. Vote. I think we know how fragile our right to vote is, how we need to exercise our right to vote, how we need to make sure people are registered and transported to the polls and all of that. And I say before, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, almost nobody stood up. And it's so important to just have every single person stand up and do what we can.
So I would just say that I think it's so important, as Reverend Sincere mentioned, I think it's so important that we each find our way, right? We each find the thing that we can do to promote dialogue, to really talk about, really difficult issues. My way was making a film that I'm grateful I'm taking all over this country. And it's challenging for me as an Asian American to enter into conversations about the Black reparations movement, but I feel like it's so important to stand up for each other. And I just have to mention that our colleague back home attorney Don Tamaki is, who's also part of the Stop Repeating History team. He is the only non-Black member of the California Reparations Task Force. And if you know Don, he's very nervous about putting himself in situations that he's uncomfortable with, but he put himself out there because that's how important he felt it was that there was an Asian American who was part of this process, who was supporting it and was bringing the information out to the rest of the community. So really, I think it's so important that we each find our way to make progress in this country.
Thank you, everyone, for providing those next steps. And I'll just add, continue to learn. We're all constantly learning. We're all still growing. So continue to read. And if something makes you uncomfortable, you're probably doing something right. So I am now honored to introduce Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who has kindly offered her time to provide closing remarks for this program. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is currently serving her 14th term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She represents the 18th Congressional District of Texas, centered here in Houston. She sits on 3 congressional committees, a senior member of the House Committees on the Judiciary and Homeland Security, and appointed by leadership as a member of the crucial Budget Committee. She is the lead sponsor of H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. Congresswoman Jackson Lee, the floor is yours.
First of all, let me, we have certain, forgive me, we have certain ways that we have. And so I appreciate the flexibility. So I will have a stand-up podium. Let me first of all thank all of the panelists here for, I know what has been an outstanding and provocative presentation. I am delighted to be able to be here with all of the organizations of which I want to cite. Particularly the Asian American Bar Association of Houston, American Constitution Society, Houston Lawyer Chapter, and the Houston Lawyers Association. Give yourselves a very, very big hand. I'm just delighted. Those of you who may be online as well. Race is a very difficult topic to talk about. It is personal, it is sensitive, and I think the difficulty that I have are the people who run away from talking about race, which is the very reason why we're still struggling with passing voting rights that is not passed in the United States Congress, and as well to, we have not passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I know that my good friend who's the vice president of the bar didn't mean for me to read that print about lobbying and all that stuff. I'm exempt. I'm going to talk about lobbying. I'm going to talk about throwing yourself down in front of a railroad tracks. Hopefully you'll get back up, but I'm going to talk about the fight. Because in actuality, if we're going to heal America, we're going to confront and have to confront the reality of who we are. And once we confront it, we have the opportunity for reconciliation, restoration, but most importantly, something that is considered a hurdle in the United States Congress and even in America, in spite of the great work that is being done in California, Governor Newsom passing legislation, creating a reparations task force or commission, the work that's been done in Evanston, the work that's been done in 42 cities with mayors like Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles and many others who've committed themselves to reparations. Even with all of that, we find that the question of race is the most difficult challenge to bring America together. And I am delighted to be in this room because obviously there's an array of diversity. People are listening to painful episodes, and always where there is pain, there is healing. There is pain in litigation. It is tough. Discovery is grueling. Reading documents is almost, for those of us who've had that experience in large litigation cases, it is sometimes a route to insanity, but you have to do it. And after that pain, how sweet the victory is if you're on the victorious side, having gone through all of those documents, prepared these large cases, and you feeling that you are right and you win. I've had that experience in practicing. My early practice was in the old Fulbright and Jaworski, which has a totally different name now. And practicing in Washington, where I really had to read a lot of documents. It's painful. But I thought I would take a moment to do what maybe has already been done, and then talk extensively, but within this time frame. So let me move quickly, the few minutes that I have, to really try to capture, and let me thank the producer of the Reparations film. I don't think I've had the privilege of seeing it, and I would look forward to members of Congress and the Reparations Task Force having an opportunity to see it. So we will engage with you on that. Let me say one of the strongest supporters of HR 40 is former Secretary of Transportation, Mineta. He warms my heart because, one, he is historic and an icon, but he has a real life understanding of what happened to all of us. And he is as much a champion as many, many Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, and others throughout the nation. So let me be very clear. We had a sharp divide just about 4 years ago that created the kind of toxicity that now we have to overcome. In the last presidency, we're being hit by COVID. For some reason, the previous holder of the office of president chose not to use the word corona, and in fact was caught striking that word out in speeches that were prepared by his staff, and continued to use the word when we talked about the coronavirus as the China virus or Kung flu. Certainly contributed to and inflamed minds that could not think differently. You know, it's a terrible thing when you are struck by ignorance. Not understanding what happened in Sugarland, you're struck by ignorance. Not understanding the reality of 246 years of slavery, you're struck by ignorance. You're struck by ignorance to recognize that Asian Americans have been coming to the United States, and you may correct me, from the early 1800s, 19th century. And that this thing called racism and xenophobia only does us in, it does not enhance us and build us up. It was sad that Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an executive order, 9066. I'm sure the ancestors of Japanese Americans know that number very well, 9066, which ordered the forced internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Before that, of course, there were an enormous number of codes and rejection of Chinese who came to this country. Rejection out of ignorance, out of jealousy over the gold mining, and obviously the building of railroads. I say this to say that compounding that history and lack of knowledge was the story of where we are today. But I'm very glad that in 1980, investigation that came about from the report of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians concluded the Japanese internment was primarily driven by racism and xenophobia, way back then. I'm very glad to say I was not in the United States Congress, but the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, ultimately John Conyers, the late John Conyers, was one of the strongest supporters in African-American of that legislation, the American Civil Liberties Act, that was signed into law by President Reagan, a Republican. You see, there should be no party divide on curing racism. There should be no party divide on uplifting the richness of diversity in who we are as human beings, as historic figures, as people who have legacies. America is an experiment. We did not come except for the Native Americans, the indigenous people. They had no people. We made it up. We were the experiment that everyone in Europe was saying it won't last, even to the extent that there were prisoners that they sent to Georgia. That's the old story that they tell, that it was indigent persons that went to Georgia. We were not supposed to last. Look at us if we could only continue to prove. As I head out to the region of Ukraine, leaving tomorrow, listening to my president today really broke my heart because as you've been sitting here, President Biden has declared that he truly believes that Russia will invade Ukraine. For what? It is a human fracture that causes us to attack someone who is different. And so I'm very glad to have been a distant supporter of that legislation and thought, as you might have thought, that we've come a mighty long way. But now we come into 2020, and here is the promotion of a Chinese virus. And so I want to just mention a few indignities that come about when people promote divisiveness, ugliness, and are fearful. In the course of this past president, a 16-year-old boy was sent to the emergency room after being physically attacked. An 81-year-old woman, these are Asian Americans, was punched in the face and lit on fire. A woman was kicked and punched and hit with an umbrella in New York. A man and his 10-year-old son were followed to a bus station by a man who was yelling and cursing at them before continuing hitting the man over the head. A 61-year-old man was slashed across the face with a box cutter on the subway in New York. His injuries required him to receive nearly 100 stitches. A woman was doused in caustic chemical. A 53-year-old woman was shoved to the ground and hit her head on a metal newspaper stand. A 51-year-old man was beaten with his own cane. These are only the reportable ones that we got in the United States Congress as we debated legislation by Congresswoman Min. I say all this to say that racism is seeded, but it can be created. All of this was in the midst where unity should have come about in fighting together COVID-19. But unfortunately, we had leadership like Germany that brought about the literal putting in jeopardy the lives of Asian Americans. I am grateful that after the American Civil Liberties Act was passed, and when John Conyers introduced H.R. 40 in 1989, our strongest supporters were Asian Americans, and they've never wavered. I know as they thought that they had passed a moment in history and that the assimilation was the rightful place for them. Assimilation for African Americans was what our dream was. We were told in the 1900s, after Reconstruction had failed and the horrors of Jim Crow came, and 4,000 plus African Americans were lynched because of racism, that all we needed to do was to get education and to assimilate, speak properly, go to school. There lies the historically Black colleges. Well, guess what? As chair of the crime committee, I held a hearing on yesterday on the violence against minority institutions. Can you imagine? The historic HBCUs in 2022 have suffered over and over again bomb threats intensified in this month. You know what some people say? Can we just have peace? And I noticed that there is the comment that the broader movement is the reconciliation and restoration. I call it the broader movement is HR 40, the repair, because before you can reconcile and you can restore, you've got to accept facts. You would have to accept the facts. Though someone would say it's political, that in the last years, the dastardly attack of Chinese flu and Kung flu did not help people's lack of understanding and rose up the ugly face of racism again on a population that worked to assimilate, but do everything that we could do. Asian Americans put on the uniform. Asian Americans shed blood in wars. Asian Americans helped build their respective communities. And Black Americans fought in wars since the Revolutionary War. They fought as slaves. And they did everything they could to assimilate. So HR 40 is about taking a pause. It's not complicated. It is a commission. It is a law that establishes a commission with academicians. And I saw in your materials that my good friend, Mr. Coates, has been quoted and recognized, where he gave a long litany of explaining that we were not where we needed to be. I was delighted that he was one of the outstanding witnesses that we had for the first powerful hearing that we had in the United States Congress historically to push HR 40. He was brilliant. But the long litany of what we don't have, we need to pause, America. You need to accept that we, as of last year, had slavery more than the country was old. And for some reason, the stigma of racism continues. And so let me just briefly give you some of those very difficult statistics. 4 million Africans were slaves. Many of you know the place of no return, which is in Accra, which is in Cape Coast. Do you know that they marched Black Africans from mid-Ghana and surrounding nations to tire them out, so that when they got to the coast, they were too weak to fight? Many of them jumped into the Atlantic, not going, and many were lost at sea. About 1 million died coming from Africa to the United States. When I talk to children, I say, we are the descendants of kings and queens. We lasted, we survived. But a brutal slavery has not penetrated the psychic of Americans, and most will say, I did not have slaves. And my friends, I will not go around and walk up and down Fannin, Smith Street, or anywhere else and point you out. You had slaves, or I don't care if you had slaves. This is not an angry initiative. This is an initiative that says America has never apologized, and they've never studied. They've never given it the dignity of what happened. So let me just quickly say this. Slavery created the economic engine of the nation. They made cotton king, and that was the transatlantic trade. And I didn't go back and say that the traders in Africa were doing spice and gold, and they said, the heck with that, it's like human trafficking. That doesn't make any money. Let's do human beings. And they traded across the Atlantic to Europe and here. And so what you had once we got here, Native Americans did not make good slaves, is you had unpaid workers who made cotton king and built the Wall Street banks and developed the economic engine that then ultimately in the 1900s made the manufacturing that started with the capital that had been created from cotton. But let me just give you a few statistics as I close. So here we are in 2022. It saddens me. There are constant stories that are being developed every year about some indiscretion tied to slavery. Insurance companies, the big ones, American General and others, have had a foundation in slavery. It is clear that many of the top universities' income was from selling slaves. We've seen that with some of the actions of students, proud as I am of them, to insist that the universities make amends. It is very important to let you know that it is clear of the inequities and the disparities that fall in the African American community. I'll give you a few and then I'll conclude with my remarks because there's a long list. Household net worth of an African American average family, $17,600. Of a white family, $171,000, while the national household median was $97,000. Black unemployment always is double in numbers, even in this atmosphere. Approximately 31% of Black children live in poverty compared to 11% of white children. Other populations are not included in here. The national average is 18%, which suggests that the percentage of Black children living in poverty is more than 150% of the national average, 31%. Why do the disparities continue? Don't we have to ask the question, do we have to always be told go along to get along? Do we have to be told stop talking about the past? HR 40 will not put us in the past. I do not want to take us back. But what I want HR 40 to do is just to pause and provide that enlightenment, that lightning rod that says, you know what, America, we do better when we understand. So someone said to me, I don't know if I can support it because LeBron James will get a check. That is the same comment from those who made statements about the selection potential of a Black woman to the United States Supreme Court. One senator said, I want someone who can read a law book and not the J. Crew catalog. Excuse me, Black women read St. John's, they don't read J. Crew. I have no idea what J. Crew is. I love you, J. Crew. I know I'm on video. Love you. Love you, J. Crew. Or one of the other known persons was saying, outrage. It's an insult to Black women. Then they're going to think they're inferior. Well, Ronald Reagan said he wanted to appoint a woman. And as you well know, there's still room for Asian Americans. That's what the court should reflect. All people. And so with that kind of stark data, over 20% of African Americans do not have health insurance compared to a national average of between 8.8 and 9.1. Constant disparities. I need not talk about the criminal justice system. Today, certainly a human being, I'm not going to critique it, certainly a human being, received 2 years for the killing of someone's baby boy, Dante Wright. And I think there was a stark statement, and I won't even editorialize it. A crying mother talked about Dante Wright as a mother. She was crying. The defendant was crying. She was emotional. But this mother says that as she was crying, the judge was just looking. As the defendant was crying, the judge was crying. I won't get into the police, and I'll just say, we just want equal understanding of our pain. That's what I would expect. And if there's pain in populations that we don't know about, we should give it. So HR 40 is, I think, the appropriate legislation for these times. And at our hearing that we had yesterday on the violence against minority institutions, the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center said, this is the time for HR 40. And so I am so grateful that you have opened the book on reparations today. I am grateful to the Asian American Bar, Houston chapter, American Constitutional Society, Houston chapter, Houston Lawyers Association, for doing something absolutely rare. And I will make the argument that you can use your social media to continue to educate people that we don't come in anger, not even anguish. We don't want to push and to point. We want to bring, to educate, to seek understanding. If we pass HR 40 at the federal level, the world watches America and says they are truly different. Because repair is an international legal concept that reparations is. If you do harm, you must repair. It was done for our friends in the Jewish community of the horrors of the Holocaust, that some dastardly persons have the audacity to even question. And the attempt was made to be fulfilled with the American Civil Liberties Act, but there have been many other occasions. Never has there been the reckoning and understanding of slavery. I do many things, from crypto to science, to budgeting, to the crime science, to the crime committee, to Homeland Security. You do many things. You are multifaceted. But when they see you, they see a certain description. When they see me, they see a description. And I only ask that America gets to the point that welcomes our diversity, but sees us as Americans having the right and the righteousness to want to cure what is hurting our community. We may be fine, but what is hurting our community? What is hurting the first grader? What is hurting, and why is a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, and others being shot by guns? Are they in neighborhoods or conditions that put them there? I would think that America would want to be the shining example of the city on the hill. Can we ever come to that point of being the shining example of the city on the hill? What you've done tonight, I hope, is open some many eyes. And what I've done, I hope, is just to capture the action item to say why we can't wait. America cannot wait any longer to be able to be the example of what happens in a nation of such potpourri, that we can look to each other's ills, each other's concerns, and we can actually, oh, that's a big mountain to climb. We can actually capture the words of Dr. King. I love them. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. And right before his death, he said, I may not get there with you, but I know that we as a collective people will get there someday. That is the America that I think we continue to fight for. I'll never give up. I am an internal optimist, loving the work to keep pushing the envelope and trying to use whatever powers I have to give each and every one of you justice when you come to seek justice, because that's what America is. Read the Constitution. The Declaration is the promise, and the Constitution is the fulfillment. Thank you all so very much. God bless all of you, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee. And that is the end of today's event. So thank you to the Asian American Bar Association of Houston, the American Constitution Society Houston Lawyer Chapter, Houston Lawyers Association. Thank you to our sponsors, V&E, AZA, Mayor Brown, and Smizer Kaplan. And have a wonderful evening.